this is going to be all off the cuff. And now this works as a really naturalistic style podcast intro. And how cool and edgy will that make us look?
I'm dying to hear it.
Anyway, I will start off with the big opening spiel. Hello and welcome to Motorsport Speak, a motorsport podcast brought to you by the team behind Motorsport Monday, a free digital motorsport magazine, and motorsportweek.com, an online 24/7 independent news source covering Formula 1, IndyCar, Formula E, MotoGP, WEC, WRC, IMSA, and more. And now we're going to be doing some Motorsport Speak. Joining me, Dan Lawrence, today is Motorsport Monday and motorsportweek.com editor Taylor Powling, who's just come off of a long, extended travel period from the Bahrain Grand Prix, and that's what we're going to be talking about today, the Formula 1 season opener, where Max Verstappen dominated proceedings, made everybody slightly wary about what's going to happen for the rest of the year, but also look ahead to Saudi Arabian Grand Prix. But before that, Taylor, how are you?
I'm good, thanks, Dan. How are you?
I'm not too bad. I'm feeling a lot fresher, I imagine, than you are after your little excursion from Bahrain via Saudi Arabia. But are you tired of Formula 1? That's what we want to know.
Well, it was a bit of a kick in the teeth after qualifying. We had that glimmer. Max Verstappen got pole by 3 tenths over Charles Leclerc, but with the caveat that Leclerc's time in Q2 was the fastest of qualifying. It set us up well for the race. Verstappen played down George Russell's comments that Red Bull had an advantage of over 5 tenths in race trim. And with Ferrari gearing more towards the race this year with their car, we had some hope that it could be Verstappen versus Leclerc like 2022. But with Leclerc's braking problems, Mercedes cooling issues, and Red Bull's absolute dominance, Verstappen was in a class of his own.
Yes. I think in the end he won by over 20 seconds, 22.457 seconds over his teammate Sergio Perez. But should we talk about Red Bull first then, in terms of the pecking order? I think they're very well established at the top. What would you say about that?
It's looking very ominous and very 2023 2.0. I think Toto Wolff put it best. Verstappen wasn't just in a different league, it was a different galaxy altogether. Controlled it. I mean, Christian Horner and Verstappen have both said that Red Bull's advantage isn't as big as it looked in Bahrain. And yeah, in some ways you could agree with that, with the problems that rivals had. But also, those early laps, Verstappen just broke clear. He was 6 seconds clear within a matter of laps. And to be honest, the winning margin probably could have been over 30 seconds if he was truly pushing.
Which he wasn't.
No. And neither was Perez. Helmut Marko said that once Perez got through the gaggle of cars ahead of him on the grid to second, and he had those soft tyres at the end, which Red Bull saved, it was about managing it and making sure he didn't wear the softs too much, that science on the more durable hard could come back at him in the closing stages.
Yeah, 100%. I think as well, Perez said starting from 5th and having to do that little fight through the pack at the start, especially with DRS opening a lap earlier, made things a little harder for him in terms of managing that tyre where he couldn't have that comfortable opening stint that Verstappen had, which was, I think, longer than all the leading pack, apart from the likes of... No, I think he pitted last, didn't he, out of the sort of the front pack?
He led every lap, so... Yeah. I mean, it's one thing having the quickest car on outright speed when you've got the best tyre degradation in the field as well. It's
almost unplayable, yes. Hopefully next week, or this weekend rather, Sergio Perez really likes Saudi Arabia. It seems to be one of his tracks where he comes alive, so it might be a little bit closer. That's the thing we definitely need is a little bit more of a close fight between the two drivers, but I'm not sure whether we're going to get that. I feel like closer fights are going to come from the odd circumstance where one of the rival teams absolutely nails everything and then Red Bull maybe slip up.
I mean, we can kind of move on from Red Bull into the other teams now with incorporating Perez into that discussion. The hopes of having a title fight, if it is Red Bull dominance again, you look at the qualifier margins, Perez wasn't that far down on Verstappen compared to usual. Bahrain usually goes quite well there, yet he still ended up 5th on the grid just because of a few tenths. And on the tracks where he's not so strong, think of Suzuka, where last year he was miles behind Max. That's the 4th race on the calendar this year. if he's lagging 7-8 tenths behind Verstappen in qualifying, you're looking at bottom order of the top 10.
Yeah, qualifying it is definitely very, very close. I think with Leclerc as well in Bahrain, if he'd have nailed Q3, if the team had nailed Q3, he would have been on pole. We could have then had maybe an interesting or feisty opening stint had he not had his catalogue of issues with the front left brakes, I believe it was.
I think well, there was an imbalance between the two. It was a 100-degree split, so the car was basically pulling to one side and a brake in. It was difficult to manage, and we saw him into turn 10. He kept locking up, couldn't slow the car down, and after the race, Fred Vasseur said it was costing Leclerc in the first 20 laps about 0.6 of a second. It then stabilised, but to the point where Leclerc kind of had to manage the issue and bring it home rather than push to his outright potential. So without that, and judging by how close Sainz was to Perez and how big track position is, even on a circuit like Bahrain, both Perez and Sainz mentioned how big the dirty air effect is this year. It's increased again from last term. If Leclerc with that track position and his confidence in Ferrari's race pace, I think Leclerc could have been a good bet for second.
Yeah, 100%. I think as well, Ferrari definitely appeared to be the second fastest team at Bahrain, and their sort of issues with race pace in the past, especially if you compare it to last year, it looked favourable in terms of, I think, Sainz in that final stint on the hard tyre. There didn't appear to be too many alarm bells. He was able to sort of give Perez something to worry about a little bit. So would you say they're definitely second place at the moment, or based on Bahrain's data?
Yeah, you can only grade it on. Ferrari have always gone well in Bahrain. George Russell alluded to that. It's not been a strong track for Mercedes. Looking at the gaps now, Sainz actually gapped Russell by 21 seconds, which basically a pit stop. Considering where Russell started the race and he was ahead of Sainz and Sainz down in fifth, that is quite a big margin. But yeah, I think we have to, a lot of the drivers have said we have to go to more circuits to really get a gauge of the pecking order. I don't think you can judge it just on Bahrain alone. But yeah, Ferrari looked promising. Their opening stint looked a bit dodgy, but we now know that that was more down to issues with Leclerc's brakes than actual outright pace.
Moving on in the pecking order, it would appear that Mercedes were perhaps third best. It's hard to gauge because, like Ferrari, they had their fair share of issues as well. We had a cooling issue for both cars. George Russell mentioning that he had to do a lot of lift and coast during the race, which sort of masked their true potential. And then we had, in addition to cooling problems in Lewis Hamilton's car, some issues with his seat. So it's really hard to learn sort of what's going on with Mercedes in terms of true pace.
Yeah, so it came as a surprise to everybody in FP2. The only practice session ran in the same conditions qualifying in the race when Mercedes went 1-2, Hamilton ahead of Russell. They dialed back a bit that qualifying pace to focus on a race-orientated setup. And when Russell put it third in qualifying, things were looking good for them. I mean, he was ahead of a load of cars that you thought could have been ahead of him on the grid. And it shows how close qualifying was that Russell was third and Hamilton was ninth. Yeah, there was 2 tenths between them. And I think that's going to be a running theme throughout this season that 2 tenths in qualifying could be the difference between being at the top end of the grid and the bottom end of the top 10. That really cost Hamilton the race with the cooling concerns. He couldn't make his way through the pack. Managed to pick off Oscar Piastri with the undercut late on. But yeah, his process kind of stemmed from qualifying really. And Russell, he was hampered by those cooling concerns. I don't think he'd been able to keep up with the Ferraris anyhow. But yeah, I mean, top 5 for Russell. I think he'll take that. Beat Lando Norris home, beat his teammate home. Good start to the season for him. Hamilton, he's positive. I think that's more because he knows he won't be here next season more than anything. And also the fact that Mercedes do have a stronger base. The car was more compliant. It looks more drivable. We'll have to see how they do at other circuits to really get a gauge of where Mercedes are at.
Yeah, I think definitely based on Bahrain, Hamilton will look at the Ferrari and feel a little bit more confident for 2025. But yeah, it's amazing he didn't sail through the field because he had his amazing different setup from George Russell, apparently, that made his car super race ready, which George Russell immediately contradicted.
Deny that. Yes, he was confused by that claim, even though it was his own teammate that made the claim. Yet Russell was confused where the origins of the claim had come from.
Yeah, a strange one. And I feel like that's not something that I think that's something we've heard before, similar stuff like that, where there's been a sort of disparity in race driver excuses in the Mercedes garage. But
Yeah,
an interesting one. But moving on, McLaren, good, not great, I think was the assessment from both their drivers, but fantastic compared to Bahrain last year, where they may as well not have bothered turning up. So I think positive start for them, 6th and 8th, a decent haul of points. They look to be around 4th best, but you never know, getting to Saudi Arabia with some high-speed corners. McLaren seem to have nailed that sort of type of circuit in terms of high-speed configurations. So it's a good start for them. And I think, again, we need more circuits. We need more time. We need more data to truly find out where they are in the fight for best of the rest, which I think will be the theme of 2024.
Yeah, I mean, McLaren came into this weekend braced for not a tough start, but not a strong start. Let's put it that way. And that kind of transpired in the end. I think they'd be happy with their finishing positions. Norris could have qualified better. He did, once again, rude another mistake. He said over the winter he'd worked on addressing his qualifying mistakes, but once again, it went begging when it really mattered on Friday night. But to beat Hamilton home in a Mercedes, Piastri not far behind. I mean, they are well clear of Aston Martin, and on a circuit that they think is going to be one of their weakest. We'll just have to see how McLaren go on high-speed circuits. As you said, Jeddah's won. Japan last year, they went really well around. They got a double podium. So I'm expecting big things from McLaren. Just, as you said, we'll have to wait and see to see kind of what their true pace is.
Right, so we've covered the top 4 pecking order from Bahrain, or what's been established as a pecking order from that very early, just one race set of data. And then it seems to be we have a copy of Abu Dhabi 2023. We have Red Bull out in front, Ferrari chasing behind, McLaren in the form of Lando Norris failing to challenge for pole due to mistakes in qualifying. And then we have Aston Martin as this sort of distant fifth party. They've sort of detached themselves a little bit from that front group, but they're way out in front if you talk about the midfield and the backfield. It was the same again in Bahrain last weekend. Alonso said race simulations pitted them as about 4th place, a bit away from the teams in front and a bit ahead of the teams behind. And that was exactly really how it played out, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. I was expecting big things from Aston Martin in the race. Maybe not as big as last year, not a podium result, but Alonso wasn't expecting much from qualifying and he over-delivered. 6th place was a phenomenal effort from him, especially when Lance Stroll went out in Q2. Less said about that, the better. And considering last year, Aston Martin had a tendency to qualify weaker than they raced, I thought Alonso had a great chance to snatch a top 5 result and really be in the mix with the McLarens and the Mercedes. But from the outset, Aston on high fuel had no pace. Both McLarens mugged Alonso at turn 1, then Hamilton did it, and he just dropped back. I mean, they tried something, and I presume they went long on the second stint, hoping for a safety car or something. It kind of sums up where they are, that Lance Stroll was round at turn 1 and at the back of the field. But even though they did a 2-stop, an unconventional 2-stop, he still got 10th. Aston Martin are clear of the pack behind, but they've got work to do to catch the 4 teams ahead.
Yeah, definitely. I think Alonso said post-race he's feeling confident this year, whereas last year they sort of put all their eggs in one basket at the start and then they fell away. He's kind of hoping for an inverse of that, and he even quoted McLaren's turnaround last year. It's not quite as severe a situation as that. I think we probably will just see them continue to bumble along, as it were, in that.
They've got some upgrades for Saudi Arabia. Mike Kratz come out, so they've got upgrades for Saudi, only minor ones, but they are upgrades, and they do believe they've got a promising base to build from. So whether it's a case of setup wise they didn't get it right in Bahrain, or the track doesn't suit their car this year, who knows? But we'll, as always, like the rest of the teams, we'll get a better assessment of their potential and prospects over the coming rounds. We'll move into more circuits, more circuit configurations, and yeah, that's when the pecking order will really start to form.
Definitely. It seems to be fairly well established where everybody is, sort of, or where they go from here in the top half of the table. We know Red Bull are fine. We know that Ferrari and Mercedes are battling for second, with McLaren sort of looking in there as well. And we know Aston have work to do to catch those guys. From there down, it seems a bit harder to gauge. I mean, we'll get to them later. We know that Alpine is a bit of a dumpster fire at the moment. But other than that, it seems quite hard to sort of tell who's where, really. You had Joe Guanyu did well. He was sort of the best of the midfield runners in 11th for Sauber or Stake or Kick Sauber or whatever you want to call them. Then you had Kevin Magnussen, remarkably, then the two RBs, and then Williams in form of Albon, Hulkenberg, Ocon, Gasly, and Bottas, thanks to his remix of that Monaco pit stop from a few years back, and then Sargent at the back because his steering wheel told him to go off at turn 4. Who's next? Who's behind Aston Martin, albeit at a distance?
On the evidence of Bahrain, you'd have to say maybe Haas, but as I said, it's hard because, like you said, Joe Guan Yu was 11th, but you wouldn't say Sauber had the sixth fastest car. It was more of a case of circumstances that meant he finished 11th. You had the RBs kind of squabbling between themselves. Their strategy didn't really work that well. Tsunoda inherited 10th when Hulkenberg and Stroll had their moment at turn 1, but then they failed. They said they failed to cover Stroll's pit stop, and that's what cost Tsunoda possibly getting a point. Haas, Hulkenberg, I mean, we all expected Haas to be battling with Alpine at the back, but one lap pace seems to still be there. And their race pace, I mean, tyre degradation, still not up to the scratch of their rivals, but it's raceable now. They're not going to be a team that qualifies well and then just slips back. They've got potential to race. And Magnussen got 12th. He was disappointed with his qualifying. Then he got 15th. Just didn't have the lap up. And Hulkenberg, we don't know what he could have done because he got front wing damage at turn 1 with a bit of a clumsy incident. Bottas went into the rear of Hulkenberg, who then spun Stroll round and then to compound Bottas's misery, he had a 50+ second pit stop, reminiscent of Monaco 2021 with Mercedes. Not quite as bad as that, but getting there. So yeah, I mean, it's one circuit. I think that bottom 5 order, the fact that Lance Stroll in 10th was the last person not to be lapped and the rest were, kind of sums up that we've got a 5-team split either way, and that those bottom 5 teams, it's going to be dependent on them to take the most of opportunities that come their way, because this race there was no retirement, so there was no room for points for them. On those occasions where reliability or incidents do happen for those top 5 teams, it's going to be which of those bottom 5 teams capitalize, take advantage, are strong on that particular weekend. And yeah, it's going to be a development race on that side as well.
I think it's going to be very difficult for any of those teams to bridge a gap to the top 5, as you say. I just don't think. I think with the budget cap in place, the resources those teams have that availability, it's just not possible, I don't think, to create that much of a turnaround. I would say, yeah, with Haas, I think we're one of the biggest surprises of the weekend, because with the testing, they racked up the most laps. I think Komatsu, new team principal, he said, we're basically focusing on race setup. It's all about race setup. So he thought, are they going to sacrifice qualifying pace? And then Hulkenberg proved that is still an inherent characteristic. It's quite quick over one lap. And then it wasn't the disaster in the race, as we all feared it would be following on from last year. It seemed to be a thing that they're heading in the right direction. So I was very impressed with Haas in terms of sort of what they were able to extract from the car across a race distance. Sauber, as you say, it's hard to really sort of see where they are. And I don't personally feel that sort of invested in them anyway, in terms of what they're doing. They finished 9th last year. They're sort of in this weird limbo phase. It's really hard to know where if they're coming or going, what's really going on there, to be honest. RB, I found, was a very interesting situation, and I'm sure you will. We all thought from Friday that maybe it was a pink Mercedes point 2, Mark II. Danny Rick denied that, and then obviously it looked like they're a midfield team still. So there's nothing to worry about there from Zach Brown's perspective, perhaps. But they had that little squabble at the end for 2 drivers, which was quite fun in terms of a drama point of view. What did you make of the little spat over the radio, sort of instigated by a feisty Japanese driver?
I mean, it was all a bit needless, really. It was over P13. As Ricardo said, if it was over points, you could understand it, but it was for P13. I mean, neither driver was going to be able to bridge that gap to Stroll anyway, even if they did get past Magnussen and Joe. I think from Tsunoda's point of view, he'll look back on that and not be embarrassed, but yeah, he'll find it a bit needless, a bit silly. And it doesn't take a claim for that Red Bull seat too well. Red Bull will look at that and that's why he's not in the running. That's why all the talk you see it's about between Perez and Ricardo. Ricardo wasn't on the pace of Tsunoda this weekend, but the way he handles situations, he's more experienced. And Tsunoda said he wants to learn from that side of Ricardo. But this weekend, that went out the window in the heat of the cockpit. He was on aging hard tyres, Ricardo on fresh softs. It's a pretty clear-cut call from a team point of view. They've given Tsunoda a chance to pass Magnussen. They've seen from the data that he's not going to be able to do it. Of course, Tsunoda's going to say that he could do it. That's what a racing driver does. And then by the time Ricardo actually got through, those soft tyres are so fragile, especially around a traction track like Bahrain, that the best of the tyres are gone, so he couldn't get past Magnussen. And the problem is, well, dirty air, it can affect a driver now from 2 to 3 seconds back. So even before Ricardo got on the rear of Tsunoda, he was still, sliding around, getting that bad weight and damaging his tyres. And he said himself after the race that he thinks the call from the team was 1 lap too late. So all around a bit of a mess, both from Tsunoda's side and also from the RB team side. And then we had that little squabble on the cool down lap where Tsunoda dived down the inside of Ricardo at turn eight hairpin, locked up, ran deep, and then he got a few bites of oversteer and nearly hit Ricardo. I don't know, well, nearly went to the side of him. It was pretty close between them. And yeah, I get there's frustration, but it's for P13 at the end of the day. If they'd have swapped round, it wouldn't have made a difference. It wasn't a points position. Sonoda should have knuckled down and accepted that the race hadn't unfolded in the way he would have liked it to from a strategy point of view. And at the end of the day, he showed his potential in qualifying. He's shown the Red Bull bosses that actually head to head, he can beat Ricardo in a straight fight. And that's just completely tarnished the weekend from his point of view.
Definitely. And I think hopefully Tsunoda learned something from the post-race debrief. But then you've got driver like Liam Lawson on the sidelines who proved that he's got a very sort of mature head on his shoulders. He dealt with his stand-in stint very well last year. Any more sort of spats or outbursts from Tsunoda maybe could put his RB seat in jeopardy. But moving on, Williams again had their issues, and it seemed to be coming from the steering wheel of all things. They finally sort of given up on their sort of old school mounted dash, and the dash is now in the steering wheel itself, and it was basically turning into sort of Skynet and trying to jeopardize the races. It sent Sargent's brake bias awry and basically ruined his race, and I think Albon had his troubles as well. I don't think they really expected much from Bahrain anyway. They were going in and saying it wasn't going to be a good race for them. There's talk that the FW46 is a more balanced car, so hopefully we'll see more from Williams down the line. It does look like they're going to be in a fight again for 7th, 8th. Doesn't look like they've made any sort of jump to me. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, and I think actually, while building a more rounded car long term will benefit them, I think in the short term, it's actually going to work against them because they're not going to have those tracks like last year, like the low downforce ones, Monza, Canada, where Albon got into 7th place and utilized the straight line speed of the FW45, just hold a gaggle of cars up behind him. They're not going to be able to rely on that. And if they've got a base car that's just a standard base, performs okay everywhere, they're going to struggle to pick up points. And it looks like it could be a tough season for Williams. I think after last year, the expectations did get raised a bit too much on what they could do. James Vowles came out and said, look, it's going to be hard to make progress from P7, especially with RB forging a closer technical alliance with Red Bull. I mean, 7th, 8th looks like they're stealing under this regulation cycle, and Vowles is aware of that. I think they're building towards 2026 and those new regulations where a team can make a sizable jump.
Yeah, it seems like we're all building towards 2026 in a way, given the sort of one-sided nature of this series of regulations. But let's talk about Alpine. Well, it didn't go well. I think they occupied the back of the grid, and then they ascended into the lofty positions of 17th and 18th by the end of the race. This is a factory team. And yes, it didn't go well for them, did it? And they've now reacted by Matt Harmon's left. The chief of aerodynamics has also left, and they've done a McLaren, and they've opted for a 3-pronged technical structure, which means obviously by Austria they're going to be on the podium, doesn't it?
Yes, that's what they've been talking about in terms of replicating McLaren. Even Bruno Famin, the team principals, come out and said that they reviewed what McLaren did last year and they're taking inspiration. Both drivers meant to the end of last year. There's no reason Alpine can't do that. But there is reason why they can't do that, because we've seen over the last few years Alpine overpromise, underdeliver. And yeah, it's just an absolute shambles, that organization. Yeah, I think it's at a point where that team is unsalvageable in its current form, and there needs to be some drastic wholesale change, because they're talking about these upgrades coming to solve the problems they got, which include the car being overweight, which the fact we're having this conversation in the third year of these regulation cycles and every other team seems to be okay on weight now says a lot about where Alpine are at.
Yeah, definitely. I think that was sort of one of my initial judgments when we saw the livery in inverted commas upon the launch. It was a complete carbon. It had flashes of color on it, but it was barely a livery. And I thought, okay, hang on a minute. There's only going to be one reason why they've done that, and it's because they're worried about weight, even though shaving paint barely does anything. And yeah, like you say, we keep having projects, we keep having these sort of targets that Alpine sets themselves, and they kick them down the road because they always fail at reaching these targets. And for a works team, they just don't seem to have the same sort of mindset that the other works teams have. You look at sort of Ferrari, Mercedes, Red Bull, Aston Martin, they all have a very clear sort of idea of where they're going and how they're going to get there. And even to an extent, the smaller teams do. RB now has a sort of a direction that it's going in. Williams, of course, has its long-term vision. Sauber's going to become Audi. Okay, maybe different. But it just seems to be a strange situation with Alpine, and I can't see it doing, as you say, it's not going to have a dramatic turnaround like McLaren last year. It's just probably not going to happen. So I don't know what the future is for that team, but it doesn't look positive, at least in the short term. Maybe their 2026 engine will be a rocket ship, and then all of their problems will be solved.
I mean, they're not holding out too much hope on based on what Viri have done with this regulations of engines. Yeah, it's a difficult one for Alpine, because it's all well and good saying you've got these upgrades to come and that they're going to transform your fortunes, but the other teams aren't standing still. It's an intense development race. And yeah, unless, at least with McLaren, when they said that they changed the car concept late in the winter, there was rationale behind it. You kind of could see there was a thought process. Alpine have just overhauled the car concept and gone, we've got upgrades coming. Every team has upgrades coming.
Yep.
So relative, how big of a leap they're going to make? Because as we've said, there's a top 5 teams. Alpine are a factory team. They should be among those 5. It should be a 6-team tier at the top end. I can't see them even becoming the leader of that bottom midfield group, let alone part of that 5-team group.
Definitely. And also you talk about like they overhaul the concept. The man who led that, Matt Harmon's now left. So
there'll be an article out at the time of recording today from Matt Harmon spoke on, I think it was either Wednesday or Thursday, the Bahrain week. And obviously by this point, he would have known that he was leaving. The wider world didn't. And he's talking about all the problems with the car and about the upgrades to come. And the one line that stuck in my mind, and we headlined with it, is we'll do our talking on the track. I can't tell if he said that because he knows he's leaving and it's not a reflection on him if things don't go to plan with the upgrades, or if he genuinely believes that, because I don't think anybody in the F1 paddock or any F1 fan would back Alpine of all teams to do their talking on the track.
Definitely not. I think if they were talking on the track, they were talking in a dialect that nobody understands. They did have I'd say a promising debut in the FIA WEC though, with their new foray into the hypercar. They scored points on debut, so they had a solid start there, and listeners will be talking about that in another episode of the podcast coming soon.
Maybe they should invest all their resources toward that and just leave F1 for another decade.
It can become Ryan Reynolds Grand Prix or something like that. Many Anthony Joshua Racing.
I mean, you've got all those investors who are investing in a team that are plumb last in the F1 Championship. I doubt they even know that, to be honest, most of them.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one. We're in this franchise era of Formula One, aren't we? In terms of the way Liberty Media have organised things, the way the cost caps worked, and that's why you see with Haas, there's no rush to sell that team because it's in a financially good place. And say with Alpine, like they're not getting results on track, but in terms of a financial exercise, it's better than losing 10, 20 years ago, when if you were losing 10, 20 years ago, you were just draining money. It used to be, I think, what was it? The fastest way to make $1 million in Formula One was to start with 100. So, but it's not the case
It'll
anymore.
be in. It'll be interesting to see what the parent Renault Group's reaction
Mm.
is to Alpine's downfall, because at the end of the day, it was still F1's a sustainable business for them. When Alpine even dropping down to sixth last year, that on track represents a failure. Off track, it's not the end of the world. Say Alpine finished eighth, ninth, 10th this year, side of things.
Yeah, and it's a strange one because obviously they did the rebrand from Renault, which obviously everybody knows about, to Alpine, which is, I mean, obviously motoring enthusiasts know that is a sort of historic name, but it's a very niche name. And I think their initial reason for doing that was the old sort of win on Sunday, sell your one make of sort of sports car on Monday. But I haven't seen a clamoring for people to rush to Alpine dealerships. Maybe they've got something that says, oh, you know what, we've really boosted our sales. There's Alpines everywhere on the roads, but I certainly don't see them around my neck of the woods. So again,
Nope.
you're talking from, yes, it's a failure on the track, but it's okay from a but are they going to just rebadge it as Renault if they keep being rubbish on the track? Because it's like, well, I bet everybody's going to buy a Renault Clio still, aren't they? I just don't know. I think we should let it unfold because God knows what's going to happen. So let's look ahead. We've got another race this weekend, another Saturday race, because obviously Saudi Arabia is on a Saturday because the holy month of Ramadan starts on Sunday. And just to sort of acknowledge that event, racing's been moved a day in advance. And I think we can probably safely assume Red Bull will probably win the race, probably Max Verstappen. I'm going to say that there will be a Charles Leclerc on the podium in third. McLaren will leapfrog Mercedes. That's going to be and Aston Martin will stay in the mix where they were. That's my prediction for Saudi Arabia. What are your hopes, feelings, thoughts, predictions heading to Jeddah?
Are you telling me that you're not believing Christian Horner saying Red Bull will be more challenged this year? Is
I
that what
don't
you are
believe a
saying?
single word of it. I guess maybe the elephant in the room was, oh, Perez was actually quite close to everybody else. But I don't know. And this is another weird, well, not a weird thing, but reliability in Formula One, as we saw, there was no retirements. It is at an insane level. So I think last year when they were like, oh, Red Bull streak's going to end because, the car's going to go wrong. It never did. Apart from they were always complaining about upshifts, which has carried over into the radio chatter this year, which seems to be just some sort of like tease that we get. But it doesn't even, it looks like it's a sort of indestructible machine. But I think, yeah, Jeddah is a high speed track. It's good fun. Mercedes might do a little bit better. Aston Martin might do a little bit better, but we'll definitely get a Red Bull win again. Probably a 1-2. I don't believe the talk.
Yeah, but I mean, Perez won last year, but we need to remember that Max was 5 tenths up in Q2 or Q1 before his then drive shaft went in Q2. So
Yeah,
for all the talk of it was more circumstances that put Perez in that position to win rather than outright pace against Verstappen. I think the only track where Perez could have a say against Verstappen this year is Baku, because Max has just outright said it doesn't suit his driving style. And I don't think he'll be too bothered about that because, for one, it's a street circuit and there's not too many on the calendar, although
at the
F1 is
moment.
trying their best to change that. Yes. But Max is pretty handy anywhere with the steering wheel in his hands. So
Yeah,
Perez has to be on top form to even win at his best track, let alone when we get to Max's best tracks and Perez's worst tracks. So yeah, I think Max will be looking to right the wrongs of Jeddah last year. I think he'll be providing his car doesn't fail him, and as you said, the reliability is just obscene. I mean, look when Mercedes dominated in 2014, you still had races like Canada where they had the problems with the brakes. Red Bull don't have those sort of problems. I think for Red Bull to be beaten this year, it is going to come down to a race like Singapore where they just don't get the car in the right window. And even on a sprint weekend now, that's not likely to happen because of the change to the path limit regulations. In terms of who's well placed to beat them at a certain track, you'd have to say Ferrari. I am excited to see how providing Ferrari get to the bottom of the probably the Brembo brakes. Bit of a tongue twister. Yeah. Interesting to see where Leclerc, because Leclerc did have the edge on Sainz in Bahrain. And also, we don't know where Leclerc thinks P2 was on to beat Perez. And I agree with him, looking at where he started and the pace comparison. And Leclerc is good around Saudi Arabia. Let's not forget he qualified second. Take Max, obviously, Max wasn't in the equation, but he qualified second last year in a car that was unstable and inconsistent at the start of the year. But his 10-place penalty again knocked him back. So Leclerc has form around Jeddah. Ferrari should go well there with their engine. Good top line speed. They've got a low drag rear wing that they're bringing in, which they kind of developed from Belgium last year onwards. Mercedes, they've seemed to solve their drag issues, so circuits like this, they shouldn't be hampered as much. McLaren still seem a little bit on the draggy side. So yeah, it's kind of hard to judge other than putting Red Bull at the top, but I think Ferrari will be their nearest competitor. Then you kind of got a mix between McLaren and Mercedes, maybe like a 1-by-1 of each team. And then Aston Martin, I've not got much hope that their minor upgrades will transform their fortunes, but we shall see.
Yeah. And Alpine will probably be at the back, I think.
Yes.
I think that is probably a good place to end our conversation, wouldn't you? I think we can see how it's all going to unfold across the rest of the week.
Let's see how wrong we are.
What I'll do now is the ending spiel. So get ready for this. That brings an end to our first episode of Motorsport Speak in 2024. So make sure to like, subscribe, review, all of those fun things you can do on all the available podcast platforms that are out there. Make sure that you stay up to date with all the motorsport news in the world on motorsportweek.com. Subscribe to our free-to-read digital magazine, Motorsport Monday, and also follow Motorsport Week on X, formerly known as Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, YouTube. I think that's all of them. You can also follow our LinkedIn page if you want to stay up to date in that realm of social media. But look out for more episodes. Look out for more content from across the motorsport world. And thank you for joining us. And Taylor, thank you for joining me. Go and have a rest and recover from Bahrain.
Needed ahead of Saudi.
Perfect. There we go.